Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liz Eberline. I am the Education Programs Manager at the National Women's History Museum outside of Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this special guest curated-led virtual walkthrough of the museum's popular online exhibit, Standing Up for Change, African American Women in the Civil Rights Movement. We're joined this afternoon by Emma Rothberg, who is the National Women's History Museum's Predoctoral Fellow in Gender Studies. And this program is part of NWHM's Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration and salute to the women who formed the backbone of the civil rights movement throughout the entire month of January. As far back as the 19th century, African American women fought for civil rights. They resisted slavery, they spoke out against racism, they established women's clubs to improve conditions for African Americans. They worked in politics and journalism, organized Black labor, and supported education. African American women were the critical mass, the grassroots leaders challenging America to embrace justice and equality for all. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording this presentation so that it can be available on our website following the event. Emma will be answering questions at the end of her walkthrough. So if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. You may ask your question at any time during the presentation, but we won't be answering those questions until the presentation is concluded. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. So Emma Rothberg is our PhD candidate in the history department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on gender, urban, labor, and cultural history in the United States. And she's very interested in the role of digital humanities and museums in expanding public awareness and knowledge of history. She's originally from New York City, and she's been fortunate to work at various other museums and cultural institutions, and we are very happy to have her as part of the NWHM team. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Emma. So Emma, take it away.
Thanks, Liz, and hello. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm really excited to take you through this exhibit and highlight a few of the women who are here. So let me share my screen. All right. So what I'm hoping to do in this presentation is to give you a little bit more information than what is in the exhibit already. I'll expand on the context and some of the individuals already in the exhibit and highlight some other names who are not. There's not enough time to go over everyone in the exhibit in depth, but skipping a name or an event is not an indication that they are less important. As a warning, I'm going to sometimes be talking about very disturbing racial violence and physical violence in this presentation. And as Liz said, I'll be happy to answer questions at the end and also provide suggested resources for more information. So Standing Up for Change, African American Women and the Civil Rights Movement was curated by National Women's History staff in 2016. So this exhibit shows that African American women have always been a part of the struggle for civil rights in the United States. They resisted slavery, they spoke out against racism, they established women's clubs to improve conditions for African Americans. They worked in politics and journalism, organized African American labor, and supported education. In the 20th century, they formed the backbone of the modern civil rights movement. African American women were the critical mass, the grassroots leaders, challenging the United States to embrace justice and equality for all. Their names, however, are sometimes not as well known as their male counterparts. African American women played large and small roles as they stood up for change over the past centuries. So there are a couple of themes that I want to highlight today. The first is the importance of the grassroots. There were thousands of women over the years who took part in the struggle for civil rights in large and small ways. They organized in their communities with their friends and neighbors, and many of these organizing networks went through their local churches. Related to that is the importance of the local. While there were struggles for national change, there were also thousands of local struggles for change. People worked on the national and the community level to make sure that their civil rights were defended and recognized. And finally, the importance of personal experience. A lot of these African American women I will be talking about were spurred to action by their own experiences and based their advocacy work on these personal experiences. So when we think about the civil rights movement, we mostly think about what happened at mid-century in the 1950s and 60s, but the struggle for civil rights was a long one and extended much further back. The suffrage movement and the anti-slavery movement were closely aligned before the Civil War. Advocates, both African American and white, worked closely together to accomplish both goals. Following the 1848 Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, many African American women suffragists and abolitionists took on leadership roles throughout the 1850s and 1860s. There were many interracial organizations and efforts in the movement for a women's right to vote. With discussions about a proposed 15th Amendment in the late 1860s, which would only take away race, not gender, as a barrier to voting, interracial coalitions began to break down and the suffrage movement splintered. But African American women continued to fight and play a large role in the suffrage movement. Many linked suffrage and reform efforts and worked through the African American Women's Club movement in order to achieve both reform and voting goals. While African American women played central and grassroots roles in the suffrage movement was still plagued by racist thinking. In particular, African American women were often ignored by organizations and movement leaders, many of whom were white women. Many organizations or local affiliates were segregated, and many white women in the movement did not think that African American women or other women of color or immigrant backgrounds should get the vote along with white women. Despite all of this important work by African American suffragists, the mainstream suffrage movement continued its racially discriminatory practices and even condoned white supremacist ideologies in order to garner Southern support, in particular for white women's voting rights. For example, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, did not allow African American women to come to their conventions. That discrimination did not stop African American women from standing up for change and working for the right to vote. So Sojourner Truth, who's pictured here, is one of the best known African American women suffrage advocates. She was a celebrated speaker during her lifetime and gave the now famous Ain't I a Woman speech in 1851 at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. We have an amazing online exhibit on Sojourner Truth that's located on our website, and I highly suggest looking at it for more information on this amazing woman. So Ida B. Wells, who's pictured here, not only fought avidly against lynching, but she was a staunch women's suffrage advocate. In 1913, NAWSA organized a massive women's suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. for March 10th, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. The parade brought tens of thousands of women from all over the country to march down Pennsylvania Avenue to advocate for the right to vote. Now, this Washington, D.C. parade was not the first women's suffrage parade. Many historians consider the first suffrage parade to have happened in 1908 in New York City, and ever since then they grew larger and more ornate, and they were expanding out of New York into other cities and towns across the nation. Women's suffrage advocates had a long history of using the streets and public spaces in order to advocate for their own right to vote. And the Washington, D.C. parade, because it was in the nation's capital, was one of the largest and one of the most important public displays for women's right to vote. So from the beginning of plans for the 1913 parade, there were disagreements for how the parade should, if at all, include African American women. And African American women had to fight just to be included. Wells Barnett traveled to D.C., fully intending to march with the Illinois delegation, as she was based in Chicago at the time. But once she got there, a white leader asked her not to march with the group and instead march at the end of the line. Wells Barnett refused. She waited on the sidewalk, and when the Illinois delegation passed by, Wells Barnett and two white allies stepped onto the street and marched in front of the delegation for the rest of the procession. This was a statement. This was a visible inclusion in a movement that African American women had been actively working in for decades, but not always treated as equal members. Mary Church Terrell, who we'll discuss soon, also took part in the parade and marched with other university graduates. Overall, it is estimated 40 African American women marched with their state delegations or with their respective professions. 2 were reported to have carried the lead banners for their section. For more on the 1913 suffrage parade and how women used the streets as scenes of advocacy, please see our exhibits Parading for Progress and Creating a Female Political Culture, which are also located on our website. So, as I briefly mentioned, the African American Women's Club movement that emerged in the late 19th century encompassed a number of local reform organizations dedicated to racial betterment. In 1896, several clubs joined to form the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, NACW, adopting the motto, quote, "lifting as we climb." Now, this was the motto of Miss Mary Church Terrell. So Mary Church Terrell was born in 1863 in Memphis, Tennessee. She was the daughter of formerly enslaved people. Her father was a successful businessman who became one of the South's first African-American millionaires. She was raised as part of the emerging African-American middle and upper class. She went to Oberlin College in Ohio, which early on established itself as an interracial and coeducational institution from its founding in the 1830s, and the college was actually a stop on the Underground Railroad. Terrell received a BA and a master's degree from Oberlin, and she later taught college and high school for African-American students. Her activism was spurred on by a horrific event. In 1892, an old friend of hers, Thomas Moss, was lynched by 4 white men who did not like that Moss's business competed with theirs. Terrell joined Ida B. Wells in her quest to end lynching, but also focused on the notion of racial uplift, the idea that African Americans would end racial discrimination if they worked to advance themselves and others through education, work, and community activism. Her words, "lifting as we climb," became the motto of the NACW, the group she helped found in 1896. She was also the president of the NACW from 1896 to 1901. In 1909, she went on to found the NAACP, and in 1910, she co-founded the College Alumni Club, later renamed the National Association of University Women. All of these organizations that she helped found were focused on equality and opportunity for African Americans. And like Ida B. Wells, she was an active proponent of women's suffrage, feeling suffrage was necessary for racial uplift. She actually picketed the White House with Howard University's Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and Howard University was an HBCU, or a historically Black college and university. This picketing in front of the White House happened a lot during the suffrage movement, and many of the picketers were actually arrested. Terrell was not arrested when she was picketing. Terrell fought for women's suffrage and civil rights because she realized that she belonged, quote, "to the only group in this country that has 2 such huge obstacles to surmount, both sex and race." She was an active member of NAWSA and worked alongside NAWSA's founder, Susan B. Anthony. She delivered 2 speeches on the challenges faced by women, particularly women of color, at the International Congress of Women in Berlin in 1904. She was the only woman of African descent invited to speak, and she received a standing ovation. So another example of African-American women and men taking to the streets to protest for their civil rights is the 1917 Silent Parade in New York City, which I have a picture pulled up here. In the summer of 1917, racial tensions simmered across the United States. During the first few days of July, violence ripped through East St. Louis, Illinois. Over 120 African-American men, women, and children were murdered or tortured. 6,000 were driven from their homes, and there was hundreds of thousands of dollars of destroyed property. In response, the NAACP organized a silent protest parade to happen in New York City. And on July 28th, an estimated 10,000 African-American men, women, and children marched down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, while tens of thousands of spectators, both white and African-American, looked on from the sidewalks. The silent parade was against segregation, lynching, disenfranchisement, and other forms of brutality. The men wore Black and the women, as pictured here, wore white, and all marched in silence. They carried signs against brutality and ones that said, "Make America safe for democracy." It was the first protest of its kind in New York and the second instance of African Americans publicly demonstrating for civil rights, but it would certainly not be the last. Both African Americans' women's participation in suffrage parades and the 1917 Silent Parade were early examples of how they would use the streets and protest marches, in order to demand equality and civil rights in the United States. These events laid the foundation and started the groundwork for what we will continue to talk about. So the 19th Amendment is passed in 1920, but it does not actually give women the right to vote. It only takes away sex as a barrier to voting. African-American women and other women of color or immigrant backgrounds, for example, found it extremely hard to vote, if not impossible, across the country, as local ordinances, poll taxes, or tests and other rules barred them from registering. Their fight for equality was not over, even if there were laws in the books that should have enforced equality. So pictured here is Mary Mcleod Bethune. She's the daughter of two formerly enslaved people and was born on July 10th, 1875 near Maysville, South Carolina. She was one of the last of 17 children born to her parents. After the Civil War, her mother worked for her former owner until she could buy the land on which the family grew cotton. By age 9, Bethune could pick 250 pounds of cotton a day. Mary Mcleod Bethune became one of the most important Black educators, civil and women's rights leaders, and government officials of the 20th century. She was a champion of racial and gender equality. She led voter registration drives and was a huge proponent of voting. She is actually credited with helping transition African American voters from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, and the demographics of the electorate still reflect this shift. Bethune was a friend of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and in 1936, FDR appointed Bethune as the Director of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration, which was created in 1935 as part of the New Deal. With this appointment, she became the highest-ranking African-American woman in government. She remained the Director of Negro Affairs until 1944. She was also a leader of FDR's unofficial Black cabinet. So when FDR proposed his New Deal, he wanted revolutionary change. This would have been a huge shift in what the government was responsible for and how it should serve Americans. But he wouldn't have gotten it without having to make a few compromises with some congressmen. So some of the compromises embedded discrimination into New Deal legislation. For example, the Social Security Act of 1935 excluded domestic and agricultural workers, many of whom were African American. What this meant was someone like Bethune's mother, who worked in agriculture growing cotton, would not have qualified for Social Security benefits. The Great Depression was hard for all Americans, but especially African American women who did not have the same support from government programs and whose already meager wages and fewer opportunities made surviving the storm that much harder. Bethune entered into government during this context and wanted to use her position in order to make things better for African American youth, particularly African American women. Bethune and the Negro Affairs Division at the National Youth Administration provided thousands of African American girls and women with educational programs and vocational training to prepare them for better job opportunities. So the NAACP was an integrated group of men and women drawn together by their abhorrence of the growing violence against African Americans, and they formed this group, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909. Many of the founders had ties to previous civil rights and women's rights causes. In the beginning, they worked on getting federal anti-lynching laws and to end segregation in public schools. Women were major players in the organization. And, just as a connection to a previous slide, again, the NAACP helped organize that 1917 silent protest parade in New York City. So we're now going to turn to the mid-century struggle for civil rights. Hundreds of African American women organized and led grassroots efforts during the civil rights era. They formed a composite image of the new African American woman leader. Some were college-educated club women, while others were grassroots organizers. Some were young adults displeased with the conditions of African American, poor, and working class people, while others were middle-aged women whose lives were testaments of struggle and survival. So many of us know the story of Rosa Parks, who's pictured here, and her brave stance to not give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, and how that courageous act sparked the Montgomery bus boycott that ended segregation on public transportation in the city. But 9 months before Rosa Parks was arrested, another young woman refused to give up her seat. So at 15 years old, Claudette Colvin was arrested for not giving up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, 9 months before Rosa Parks. On March 2nd, 1955, Colvin was taking the city bus home after school with 3 friends. The 4 young women sat in the row just behind the white section of the bus. A little later, a white woman got on the bus and the driver told Colvin and her friends to move because the white section was full. Colvin refused, arguing asking her to move was unconstitutional. The bus driver alerted traffic police, and 3 stops later, the police got on the bus, asked Colvin to move again, and when she refused, they dragged her off the bus. The police took Colvin to jail. With her arrest, Colvin became the first person arrested for breaking segregated bus laws. Once at jail, the police booked Colvin as an adult. Again, remember, she's only 15 years old, and they refused to let her call home. Luckily, her friends knew what was happening and called her mom, and her mom called the minister, and the minister came and paid her bail. Colvin did not go into this act blind. She was a youth council member of the local NAACP chapter, and she actually knew Rosa Parks because Parks was the secretary of that local chapter. Colvin knew the NAACP was planning to officially fight segregation in Montgomery when she performed her act of civil disobedience, but the NAACP did not pursue her case because she was too young. So 9 months later, Parks is arrested for the same thing, and that sparks the Montgomery Bus Boycott. The boycott lasted 381 days. Women mostly took the bus in Montgomery, so when they boycotted it, it really hit the bus system's bottom line. It also meant that women were heavily involved in the organization of the boycott and creating alternative forms of transportation for those who chose to participate. Eventually, the boycott ended segregation on public busing. There were thousands of women who played active roles in the civil rights movement. They marched, they organized, they advocated, they voted, or they tried to, raised money, wrote letters, attended meetings, and stood up to Jim Crow every day of their lives in both large and small ways. So I'm going to expand on a few of the women featured in the exhibit and highlight some new names. Here are some more pictures. So as president of the NAACP's Arkansas chapter and co-owner of Arkansas's largest Black newspaper, Daisy Bates, pictured here, played a crucial role in school desegregation. In 1957, Bates and her husband recruited 9 students to integrate the all-white Central High School. They became known as the Little Rock Nine. Adults were not the only ones fighting for civil rights in school. At the age of 6, Ruby Bridges advanced the cause of civil rights in November 1960 when she became the first African-American student to integrate an elementary school in the South. Born on September 8, 1954, Bridges was the oldest of 5 children for Lucille and Avon Bridges, farmers in Tylertown, Mississippi. When Ruby was 2 years old, her parents moved their family to New Orleans in search of better work opportunities. Ruby was born the same year as the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education, which ended racial segregation in public schools. Despite the ruling, many Southern states were slow or refused to integrate, including New Orleans, where Bridges attended a segregated kindergarten. In 1960, a federal court ordered Louisiana to desegregate. School districts, in response, created an academic entrance exam for African-American students, ostensibly to see if they could compete academically with white students, but also as another hurdle for African-American students to get into then all-white schools. Ruby and 5 other students passed the exam. Her parents were hesitant to let her attend the all-white school, as were the other parents of the children who had passed the exams. The school districts also dragged their feet about admitting the students. Eventually, only 3, including Bridges, decided to attend the then all-white schools. Ruby and her mother were escorted by 4 federal marshals to the school every day that year. She walked past crowds screaming vicious slurs at her. Segregationists pulled their white children from the school. Many teachers refused to teach the African-American students. Barbara Henry, a white Boston native, was the only teacher willing to accept Ruby, and all year she was a class of 1. Ruby ate lunch alone and sometimes played with her teachers at recess, but she never missed a day of school that year. There was both support and protest of Ruby's actions, and it took a personal toll on her and her family. Her father lost his job, the grocery store refused to sell to her mother, and her sharecropping grandparents were evicted from the farm where they had lived for 25 years. Eventually, other African-American students came to integrate the school and others across the South. Bridges remained a lifelong advocate for racial equality and wrote books about her experience, started a foundation, and continued to advocate for education. Ruby Hurley was on the front lines of the modern civil rights movement as an NAACP executive. Hurley became the NAACP's National Youth Secretary in 1943. She was an advocate for nonviolent legislative activities and advocated for equality for all. Hurley was born and raised in Washington, D.C., where she attended the academically oriented and predominantly African-American school, Dunbar High School. The school attracted many well-educated instructors, among them the son of Frederick Douglass, who taught Hurley. She graduated from high school in 1926. She went to college and worked for the African-American-owned Industrial Bank of Washington and took night classes at the Robert H. Terrell Law School, although she did not complete her degree. Hurley's activities with the NAACP began in 1939, the year Marion Anderson, the world-famous opera singer, had been hired by the Daughters of the American Revolution to give a performance at the organization's Constitution Hall. When the organization barred Anderson from performing there, Hurley and a committee of NAACP civil rights advocates moved the performance to the Lincoln Memorial. Anderson's concert was held on April 9th, 1939, and it was attended by thousands in Washington, D.C. As youth secretary, she expanded the youth councils and college chapters, adding over 200 new groups. In total, the NAACP youth groups incorporated 25,000 members by the early 1950s, due in large part to Hurley's efforts. In 1952, she became the regional director of the Southeast Regional Branch of the NAACP, and this then became the largest group within the NAACP. She was thus the rare woman to hold a senior leadership position in a national civil rights organization. As director, she mainly focused on increasing membership, civil rights advocacy, and investigating racial incidents and murders in the area. So she investigated and compiled reports on the murders of Emmett Till, Reverend George Lee, and Medgar Evers. Her civil rights advocacy did not go unnoticed, and unfortunately, she frequently received threats to her life and to her work. She retired in 1978 after 39 years of working for the NAACP and died in 1980. Dr. Dorothy Irene Height was born March 24th, 1912 in Richmond, Virginia, and she was raised in Rankin, Pennsylvania. She excelled as a student, and Height eventually received a scholarship to attend college. In 1929, she was admitted to Barnard College in New York City, but was not allowed to attend because the school did not admit African Americans. Instead, Height went on to graduate from New York University, where she received a bachelor's in education and a master's in psychology. Her civil rights career began in the 1930s protesting discrimination in Harlem, and she became a leader in the local Young Women's Christian Association and pushed for integration in their facilities. During a chance encounter with Mary Mcleod Bethune, Height was inspired to begin working with the National Council of Negro Women, so the NCNW. Through the NCNW, Height focused on ending the lynching of African Americans and restructuring the criminal justice system. From 1957 to 1997, she served as the president of the NCNW. She was rarely in the public eye, but Height was known as the glue holding the top echelons of civil rights leaders together. One major time she was in the public eye was on August 28, 1963. Height took a seat on the speaker stage at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. She was surrounded by most of the famous civil rights activists. She sat there, but was not scheduled to give remarks. Afterwards, African American leaders like Height vowed that women would not be excluded in the future. And just kind of as a fun anecdote, Height would always make sure to put herself in the center of pictures so she couldn't literally be cut out. So Gloria Richardson, who's pictured here in the center, was a leader in the civil rights movement, but she diverged from MLK's nonviolent stance to argue that self-defense could deter future violence. She was born in 1922 in Baltimore to a middle-class family with a history of local activism. She grew up in Cambridge, Maryland. Her parents were the owners of grocery stores in Cambridge's Second Ward, a predominantly African-American community separated from the white neighborhood by Race Street. The men in her family were known as racemen, who worked to alleviate the oppression of poor African-American people. Richardson was acutely aware of the toll racism could have on families. Racism and the denial of appropriate health care because of it caused the early deaths of her father and her uncle. Richardson attended Howard University and earned a degree in sociology. While there, she protested at the local Woolworths and also protested conditions at Howard. She then returned to Cambridge, Maryland shortly after graduation and worked as a civil servant during World War II. After the war, she tried to get a job as a social worker, but the Maryland Department of Social Services would not hire her or any other African-American social workers. Richardson attended the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC's, 1962 Atlanta Conference and returned to Cambridge with a new outlook on organizing. She became a member of SNCC's executive board, and Richardson helped create the Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee in 1962. The organization fought to desegregate public institutions. Richardson influenced a rising generation of Black Power leaders, including H. Rap Brown, Stokely Carmichael, and Cleveland Sellers, who participated in the Cambridge movement and were impressed with Richardson's tactics. So this is Lola Faye Hendricks. She was born in 1932 in Alabama. She graduated from business school and did clerical work for an African-American owned insurance company in Birmingham. Lola was also actively involved in local civil rights work. She worked with the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, or the ACMHR, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. She helped organize the mass meetings, nonviolent protests, and economic boycotts that defined the struggle for racial equality. She also served as a liaison between the leaders of the SCLC and community members in Birmingham. One anecdotal story of how she helped the movement was when she traveled north to collect funds for local efforts and toys for poor children in the community. One Christmas, the toys filled her living room, and her then young daughter, Audrey, who we're also going to talk about, remembered being sad when the toys started going out the front door. Now, at the time, Birmingham was one of the most segregated and violent cities in the United States during Jim Crow. City ordinances continued to enforce segregation even after the Supreme Court ruled that the separate but equal doctrine in public facilities was unconstitutional in 1963. And remember, we had already had Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Lola and her husband, Joe, were the named plaintiffs in an ACMHR-backed lawsuit suing the city in 1959 to force integration of public parks. And they actually won that case in 1962. In response, the city of Birmingham closed all the parks rather than integrate them. The city went so far as to actually fill in the holes on the golf courses with concrete so that no one could play. Lola frequently hosted civil rights leaders in her home, and she worked with them to organize local efforts, including in 1963, when Martin Luther King came to Birmingham to organize anti-segregation activities. Lola's daughter, Audrey, recalls the conversations that happened in her home and got to know these civil rights leaders on a first name or nickname basis because of her mother's involvement. Audrey recalled, quote, Mike, that's what we called Martin, Andy, Fred, they'd stand in the kitchen while my mother made dinner. Mike would lift off the top of a pot and say, what's cooking, Lola? In July 1963, Lola passed the federal examination and was hired by the federal government to work at the newly integrated Birmingham Social Security Administration. She was one of the first African-American federal employees hired. She started as a filer, and she was promoted up the line to secretary and unit clerk in 2 years. In 1967, she left the Social Security Administration and went to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. She worked there as a secretary, supervisor, and specialist until 1983. And in 1988, she went back to the Social Security Administration and worked there until her retirement. So Lola's daughter, Audrey, was born in 1953 in Birmingham, and she's pictured here. On May 2nd, 1963, 9-year-old Audrey Faye Hendricks became the youngest known person arrested during the civil rights movement. She was one of hundreds of children who took part in marches against segregation in the city of Birmingham. Demonstrating against segregation was illegal, and marchers would be thrown in jail. Many adults were scared of getting arrested and feared for their jobs and safety. MLK spoke in Hendricks' church, encouraging both adults and children to join in the efforts. Hendricks was inspired by MLK's words, and that night she went home and declared to her parents, quote, I want to get arrested. Her parents supported her decision. On May 2nd, Hendricks and thousands of other children stepped off from the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church and began singing, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Round. She was the only student from her school, a segregated school. Her parents watched proudly as she was arrested for parading without a permit and taken to the juvenile hall at City Jail. Hendricks recalled that while in jail, she had to share a bathroom with 15 to 20 other girls. quote, "I didn't have any fresh underwear or a change of clothes or a toothbrush," she said. She and 500 other children were released from jail on Wednesday, May 8th. She went to school the next day and no one asked her about her time in jail. Quote, "I was just one of the kids as everybody else was. It didn't dawn on me that it was a big deal." Hendricks was one of thousands of children who took part in the Children's Crusade, a series of marches in Birmingham to end segregation. The children were attacked by the police, led by Eugene Bull Connor, who used dogs and fire hoses to physically knock them down. When the jails got full, the children were kept in the fairgrounds. The images of children being attacked by dogs and fire hoses was so powerful that it inspired many people to get involved and forced the federal government to take action. After her role in the Children's Crusade, Hendricks continued her work around civil rights. She volunteered to be a part of the first class to integrate the local high school, a full 15 years after Brown versus Board of Education. Hendricks went to college and worked in Dallas, Texas for 8 years before returning to Birmingham. She worked with young children and low-income families in the city for 25 years. In 2007, she earned a master's degree, writing a thesis on women, like herself and her mother, who participated in the civil rights movement. Known as the Civil Rights Queen, Audrey Faye Hendricks died in Birmingham in 2009. Amelia Boynton Robinson had brought MLK and the SCLC to Selma, Alabama to campaign for voting rights. The team set up headquarters in Robinson's home to plan a protest march from Selma to Montgomery. Robinson was beaten unconscious when she tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge during that march. Her bloody image published in newspapers drew national outrage and attention to the cause. And connected to those events is pictured here Joyce Parish O'Neill. O'Neill was born in Selma, Alabama in 1948. Both of her parents were teachers. Selma, Alabama was a deeply segregated city. O'Neill remembers her grandmother telling her to keep her hands to herself when they went downtown. If she was caught touching anything, she might be accused of stealing. She also recalled her mother would make her and her sister hamburgers whenever they wanted so they could avoid having to order them from a segregated window downtown. O'Neill went to a segregated high school, even though the Supreme Court had ruled school segregation unconstitutional in 1954. In 1965, O'Neill was a junior in high school. The federal government had just passed the Voting Rights Act, which was meant to enforce African Americans' right to vote. Despite the federal act, many African Americans were still turned away from the polls and voter registration desks by local ordinances and local officials. O'Neill's mother was one of them. Every time she went to register to vote, her application was stamped denied. O'Neill would sometimes accompany her mother when she tried to register, and because of witnessing her mother's problems, she and the family were, quote, all for the movement for voting rights. O'Neill also never missed a mass meeting at either her church, Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church, or First Baptist, where SNCC was headquartered. At First Baptist, O'Neill learned how to march, what to do if attacked, and about nonviolence. She would then go to Brown Chapel with her sisters, friends, and other children to march to the courthouse with the signs that read, "Let my parents vote." O'Neill remembers frequently sneaking out of school to join marches. She said it was, quote, a practically everyday occurrence to walk to the courthouse, and there was fear because marchers were frequently arrested or beaten back. Fortunately, O'Neill was never arrested or beaten, but she knew many people who were. Both her sister and her best friend were arrested for marching. On March 7th, 1965, O'Neill witnessed Bloody Sunday as hundreds of peaceful marchers tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge during their march from Selma to Montgomery in support of the vote. The police and deputized white residents attacked. O'Neill stood on the steps of Brown Chapel and watched the violence unfolding along the bridge in Selma. Included in the number attacked were the late Representative John Lewis and Amelia Boynton Robinson. The scenes of Bloody Sunday caused a national outcry and forced further enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. When it was time for O'Neill to register at the age of 18 in 1966, both she and her mother were able to go to the courthouse and register without hassle. When she first voted, O'Neill had a profound sense of pride and a great feeling about everything that she and others had done to make her registration possible. O'Neill graduated from Stillman College and HBCU and spent most of her career working in social work and social services in Alabama, and she still lives in Selma. The National Women's History Museum will be speaking to Joyce Parish O'Neill about the Selma Teachers March in 1965 on January 24th, which is next week. You can find the registration link on the homepage of our website, and I highly encourage you to go to that event and listen to this amazing woman talk about her experiences. So after years of highly publicized demonstrations, marches, and violence, American political leaders acted to enforce to secure the civil and voting rights of African Americans. Two significant laws, the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, were among the civil rights movement's most important achievements. African American women lobbied strongly for their passage. So on August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. for a political rally known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedoms. It was organized by a group of civil rights and religious organizations, and it was designed to illuminate the political and social challenges confronting African Americans. While MLK gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, women were not featured as speakers. The march was effective, and on June 11, 1963, John F. Kennedy unveiled plans to pursue a comprehensive civil rights bill in Congress. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill into law. The law's 11 sections prohibited discrimination in the workplace, public accommodations, public facilities, and agencies receiving federal funds, and strengthened prohibitions on school desegregation and discrimination in voting registration. When President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Bill into law on August 6, 1965, Amelia Boynton Robinson, heroine of the Selma March, was invited to witness the signing. From the nation's beginning, African American women added an intellectually diverse landscape of ideas to the solution for racism and oppression. They've had to overcome the double bind of racism and sexism, which marginalized them within both women's and civil rights movements. Yet they persevered to provide rich, vibrant voices to the chorus of American freedom, justice, and independence. They worked at the grassroots, community level, and at the national level. They focused their advocacy on issues that they had personally experienced and used those experiences to motivate them to stand up for change. Thank you. I look forward to your questions. And Liz, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma, for sharing those wonderful stories of the women and kind of the grassroots movement of the civil rights movement and how women came to be such a large part of that. One of the questions that we got, and this is something that comes up a lot when I'm doing a virtual field trip on standing up for change, is the story of Claudette Colvin. I mean, we know Rosa Parks, and she was the one who kind of sparked the Montgomery Bus Boycott. She is the name that we really know when we're talking about not giving her seat up on the bus. But Claudette Colvin did it first, and she was younger. So why is it that we don't know as much about Claudette Colvin as we do about Rosa Parks? I know that, you know, there's a little bit of, you know, kind of about her background, and she was also so young as well. So, you know, why do we know Rosa Parks but not Claudette Colvin?
It's an interesting question, and I have to admit, I didn't know about Claudette Colvin until I started putting together my notes for this presentation. And it was actually stumbling across a video from the education department at the National Women's History Museum talking about a small exhibit that you had on her at the actual museum when I first learned her name. So I think in part there is the age factor. The fact that she was so young and the NAACP didn't pursue her case means that her name is not the one that gets put into the history books, right? Rosa Parks is the one who the NAACP chose to highlight, and that's what our high school textbooks then highlight, right? She was the national face of this movement. That doesn't mean that Rosa Parks was less important because she didn't do it first. Obviously, her courageous act sparked quite the change in Montgomery and then later across the nation. But I think what's interesting about Claudette Colvin is not only was she so brave for someone so young, but she is representative and emblematic of so many people whose names go unmarked in the history books, who stood up for change and stood up for their rights in small ways, in everyday ways, both big and small. And because of that, she is important in her own right. And I think she's also important as a symbol of all of these nameless people who have fought so hard for their own rights and the rights of others.
And as we're talking about, I mean, we're talking really about the grassroots movement of the civil rights movement. And so would you say that women really were the most important factor that led to the success of the civil rights movement?
I mean, I think it's hard to imagine the civil rights movement being as successful as it was without the efforts of the grassroots. That's not to discount the leaders. It's not to discount the amazing work that these organizations were doing. But unless you have foot soldiers, you can't accomplish the things that you want to accomplish. And the fact that women were so important, not only in taking to the streets and marching, sitting at those counters at Woolworths, but doing what Lola did, which was provide meals for Martin Luther King and Fred and other movement leaders, that I think to call African American women the backbone of the civil rights movement is an apt and accurate assessment.
Well, and I think too, I mean, when you're talking about something like this and kind of the grassroots of this movement, I mean, it's community too. I mean, women are very heavily involved in their churches and in their community, and that's really where this kind of spreads, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I am not, the civil rights era is not my era of expertise, but in all of the books that I read in my graduate courses for my comprehensive exams, the church is first and foremost one of these main sites of civil rights organizing, right? I mean, Martin Luther King was a preacher, or he was a pastor, excuse me. So yeah, I mean, when we think about the church and we think about African American women's role in that church, the church has long served as a site of African American community and organizing, right, dating back into the 19th century. This is not just something that happened in mid 20th century. But yeah, I think the ways in which you think about how women participate in the church, again, maybe they're the ones who are working behind the scenes. They're the ones who are passing out pamphlets. Even when you go to your own place of worship and you see the people who are milling about, if you think about that already organically built community and what they can then do when they put their minds to it, you can't underestimate the importance of those women and their roles in the church, including Joyce Parish O'Neill, who again, really encourage you to go listen to her talk next week.
And as far as the kind of photos that we're showing, and sometimes there are group photos of some of these women, do we know who all of the women are in the group photos? Is there documentation of that, or?
I'm going to quickly look at. So I guess the easiest and the shortest answer for me is no. I don't think we know who all of these women are in all of these pictures. The citations at the end of our exhibit say that the photos are from the collection of Life magazine and the Bancroft Library, which is attached to UC Berkeley. But I think this is kind of a good opportunity to plug kind of citizen historians. If there are plenty of libraries, archives, institutions who ask people who are interested to help them identify individuals in photos or to help them do transcription work. So the most important thing is that we try to bring the names to these photos. And while we might not know all of the names right now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a chance to fill in those gaps. So if you are interested in trying to do that, I highly suggest looking into some of these, your local libraries, your local historical societies, your local museums and seeing if they have some of these kind of citizen historian jobs for you to do. But the short answer to the question is I don't think we know the names of every single woman pictured in the photos in the exhibit.
And would you, we talk about the suffrage movement. We talk about how, the abolition movement really kind of sparks the suffrage movement. So would you say without the abolition movement, without the suffrage movement, without those, there would be no civil rights movement? Is that, kind of an interesting kind of a question to ask?
It's certainly an interesting question, and kind of thinking as I talk here, if we want to talk about the civil rights movement, capital C, capital R, capital M, that we think about that's happening in the 50s and 60s, to say that that wouldn't have happened without that long history of abolition and suffrage, I'm not sure that I would go so far as to say it wouldn't have happened. I also like to think about the kind of 50s and 60s civil rights movement as part of this long movement for civil rights that does date back to the times of slavery, and does date back to the suffrage movement. And there certainly is a continuum. The actions and the advocacy, the tactics, they certainly build on each other. But I think it would be hard to say that there would have been no civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s without the work that had happened before. It certainly is connected, but individuals are going to stand up for themselves, and I don't think that they need, they don't need kind of like a long history in order to say this isn't right, and I'm going to do my best to try and change something.
Well, and I mean, the civil rights movement really is a product of the Jim Crow, and that is coming from. So, I think abolitionism and the abolition of slavery then kind of sparks in the Reconstruction era, sparks the Jim Crow laws, and which, eventually does lead into the civil rights movement. So I think there probably, yes, there is some connection. Had that not all happened, certainly there's no need for the civil rights movement. I don't think. But talk a little bit about kind of when you're putting together kind of from a larger picture, talk a little bit about putting together an exhibit. We're having a question here about where the first photo in the presentation came from. So I know that we have some documentation as to where that came from, but just talk a little bit about where we find, these sources, when we're putting together this presentation.
I'm just scrolling back to see what that first photo is. So while I did not curate this specific exhibit, I do want to be clear on that. When we do think about curating an exhibit, and I have curated one also through Google Arts and Culture, which is what Standing Up for Change is for the National Women's History Museum. The first and foremost, we try to find photos that are interesting, right? We want them to be dynamic. We want them to help us tell our story. Taking a picture of an individual is incredibly important, but if you can find a picture of that individual doing something rather than a static portrait, it's going to help you tell that story. It's going to aid you as a source and not only as a visual. So we like to look for photos that are in the public domain. It's really important to find photos that you actually can use. And if you ever do want to put together an exhibit yourself, make sure that you're not violating copyright laws. But places that are really great to look for photos: the Library of Congress, the National Archives and Records Administration. Different museums will sometimes give you permissions to use those photos. And even though we're always told don't use Wikipedia as a source, Wikipedia actually has a great selection of photos that are in the public domain. And most of the photos on Wikipedia are actually public domain. You can use them. Does that answer the question? I feel like
and did you mention where that first photo came from, where that source was?
The title slide?
Yes.
The title slide is from the Life Photo Collection. It is by Charles Phillips, The Poor People's March on Washington, April 1968.
And talking a little bit more, I have a question more specifically, which I can kind of answer. The question is, are these NWHM virtual exhibits, are they permanent? For the most part, yes, we do keep them up on a permanent basis. We do occasionally go back and, as we have new information, we'll update the exhibit to make sure that we have the most up-to-date information that we possibly have. And if there's new scholarship that comes out, we certainly want to include that. There are some exhibits that might be a little outdated that we pull from our website and work to update, but standing up for change, for instance, these type of exhibits that we currently have on our website, they are permanent exhibits that will be on the website for the foreseeable future. So just kind of know that. I did also include in the chat box, I included a link to Standing Up for Change, as well as additional links to some additional sources that Emma provided for today. And if you're interested in those sources, I've linked to bookstores if you're interested in purchasing those resources as well. I do have kind of one question specifically for you, Emma, is what is your next project?
Ooh, what is my next project? So as a fellow at the museum, I am working on a lot of biographies that go up on our website. So those are the Fab 5 biographies, and every month we highlight 5 new women who have contributed to the United States and our history, and they're normally organized around a theme. So I am starting to think about the March biographies, which are centered around the theme of Women Inspire. And I am also, because I am my dissertation work is mostly in late 19th and early 20th century US history. And I also study the suffrage movement. I'm going to be creating a virtual map of some suffrage activities that happened in and around Washington, DC. Try to get that up on the website so you can kind of do a virtual walking tour while we're still all safely in our homes. So those are the next things on my docket. And then of course I have my dissertation to finish for grad school. That's a separate project.
Just so everybody is aware, I know not everybody knows that the National Women's History Museum, but we are a completely online organization currently. We, if you're interested in additional resources for students and educators, we have other online exhibits outside of Standing Up for Change. We do have lesson plans, biographies, as Emma mentioned. We do add 5 brand new biographies every month, but we are completely online. We do not yet have a physical space. We are looking towards that. We certainly hope that once we move through the pandemic and we can get through that, we are hoping that we will have a space here in Washington, DC, but right now we exist fully online at the moment. So one kind of final question here. So when we're talking about, African American women versus, white women in college enrollment, was the rate of enrollment by African American women in colleges and universities comparable to white women?
Ooh, so the short answer is I don't have that fact on hand, but based on what I do know, many universities and colleges in the country wouldn't have allowed African Americans to enroll until the 1950s and 60s. So many of the women who we talk about, or who I talked about in the exhibit, went to these historically Black colleges and universities. And there are certainly many of them in the United States, but there's not as many HBCUs as there are colleges who were only admitting white students. So I guess the other thing is to say that with segregated secondary education and with fewer job opportunities, there were many African American women who would not have been able to make that choice to go to college because financially they did not have the opportunities or the backing from their communities because of systemic racism and because of inequalities in institutions. So all of that is to kind of circle around the question because I don't have the answer directly, but it is something that I would be interested to know. And particularly if African American women and white women enrolled in colleges at the same rate, I think that that is a huge testament to what all those African-American women had to do and had to overcome in order to get a college education.
And you mentioned a little bit, you talked a little bit about the silent parade. What year was that?
That was 1917.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, it looks like we have kind of come to the end of our questions. One thing I did want to kind of go back and mention, and we talked a little bit about Claudette Colvin at the beginning of the Q&A. And I apologize, I did not mean to gloss over this. She was pregnant when she was 15 and she was pregnant, she was unmarried, which is one of the reasons that the NWACP chose not to take up her case. I apologize, I did not mean to gloss over that when we were talking about that a little bit earlier. But that was one of the reasons that the NWACP did not take up her case. And then Rosa Parks subsequently kind of became the face of this movement. So I did just want to clarify that point here before we finished. So I think that kind of comes to the end of our questions. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here and thank Emma so much for being with us today, again, sharing these powerful stories and the women behind this grassroots movement. If you enjoyed this program today, please join us next Sunday, January 24th at 3 p.m. when we're joined by Diana Vega and sisters Joyce Parish O'Neill and Phyllis Parish Alston as they reflect on the bravery of their mother, Lola Too Sweet Parish, and the 100 teachers who demonstrated in the Teachers March on January 22nd, 1965 in Selma, Alabama. Mrs. O'Neill and Mrs. Alston will recount their memories of that event, as well as the fear and pride they felt on their mother's behalf. Lula was a role model to both her students and daughters, and she inspired their subsequent philanthropy and activism in the name of equity and equality for all Americans. Please also join us for Brave Girls virtual story time at noon on Wednesday, January 27th, where we will be joined by children's author Sandra Neal Wallace for a reading of her book, The Teachers March, How Selma's Teachers Changed History. All of these events are free. We do require registration in advance. If you are interested in attending those programs, please find the registration links on the NWHM Presents Sundays at Home page on the NWHM website, womenshistory.org. So I would just like to wrap up by thanking everybody for attending today and for all of your wonderful questions. Thank you to Emma for being with us. If you have any additional questions that you'd like to ask, please feel free to reach out to us at history@womenshistory.org. We're happy to answer any additional questions, and we certainly hope to see you at future programs. So that will do it for us today. Thank you so much to everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon, a wonderful day, and stay safe, and we hope to see you soon. Goodbye, everyone.